Hello friends, today we are discussing the subject Microprocessor Unit 6 Interrupts and Polling. Interrupts Unit 6 of the microprocessor. And what is an interrupt? An interrupt is an event that indicates the microcontroller to take immediate action. When an interrupt occurs, the microcontroller pauses the task it is currently executing and execute the corresponding interrupt handler, which is known as the interrupt service routine. After handling the interrupt, it switches back to the usual task it was executing. The interrupt is nothing but an event which indicates the microcontroller or the CPU or the processor to take the immediate action, or interrupt is an event which demands the processor attention. It is a process which demands the attention of the processor, that is known as an interrupt. When an interrupt occurs, the microcontroller or a processor causes the task it is currently executing and execute the corresponding interrupt handler, which is known as an interrupt service routine. So whenever the interrupt is occurred, the processor stops the execution of currently executing the process, and that is, it executes the interrupt handler, which is known as the interrupt service routine. After handling the interrupt, it switches back to the usual task it was executing. Means whenever an interrupt is evoked, a processor stop the executing current process, it gives the control to that interrupt. That means the interrupt service routines, that interrupt is handled or that interrupt is service, attention is given to that interrupt, the service routine is executed, and after executing that service routine, the control of the processor given back to the processor, a task which is executing. Uh, this is an interrupt, and polling is a mechanism that indicates the microcontroller, a processor, that a device requires its attention. In contrast to the interrupt, polling is a mechanism that indicates the microcontroller or a processor that a device needs its attention. A polling or interrupt is a request or made by the certain device that it needs a processor attention, whereas the polling is a mechanism that indicates the microcontroller that it needs the. This is a continuous act to figure out whether a device is working properly. That means a processor continuously check whether any device needs the service, whereas an interrupt which is occurred by the device at any time, okay, which is raised by the device. But a polling, it is a process in which a processor itself look up for a service of a processor to any device or any process. Usually polling often involve a low level hardware. An interrupt is an event that is triggered by the external component other than the microcontrollers. Okay, the interrupt is an event that is triggered by the external components other than the microcontroller. Polling is a synchronous activity that samples the status of an external device by a client program. Polling is a synchronous activity that samples the status of an external device by client program. When an interrupt occurs, the interrupt handler is executed. In the polling, the microcontroller or a processor provides the services. The interrupts can occur at any time, while the polling can occur at a regular interval. That means a processor at a regular interval observe that any device needs the service, but an interrupt is occur at any time by a device. Interrupt is occur by a raised by the device. It is raised by the process. It is raised by any such devices. But a polling where a processor look up for it that any device needs the service. This is the main difference between a interrupt and a polling. In the interrupt request line indicates that a device needs. In the polling, command ready bit indicates that a device needs the service. In the interrupt request line indicates that a device needs the service. Interrupt request line indicates that a device needs a service, whereas in a polling command ready bit indicates that a device needs the service. Interrupts does not waste many CPU cycles. Interrupts does not waste any CPU cycle, while the polling wastes a lot of CPU cycle. Because how we say that a CPU does not waste and an interrupt does not waste many CPU cycles, because whenever an interrupt is raised, a processor gives the attention to that interrupt. That means it stops the execution of the current process and attempt that interrupt. That means it attempt the interrupt service routine. It executes the interrupt service routines and stops the execution of the current processes. So in the polling case, a device or a processor continuously periodically check for a service. The processor service is required. Is there any processor service is required by the device? This is a periodically check done by the CPU. As such, we say that if there are 10 such devices connected to the system, uh, in case of the polling, a processor check whether a first device needs a service. If a device doesn't give any reply, a processor goes for the second device. A second device needs for the service. If there is a second device doesn't reply for it, it goes for the third, it goes for the fourth, and lastly, if a fifth device needs the service, of it give provide the service to the fifth devices. That means a first four CPU cycles which are requesting for any services are waste. But in case of the interrupt, whenever an interrupt is raised, the processor stop executing the current process and gives the attention to that interrupt. That means the interrupt service routine start executing. So this is a main part here, that interrupt does not waste many CPU cycles, whereas the polling wastes a lot of CPU cycles. In case of the interrupt, it is inefficient when the device interrupt the microcontroller or a processors. In case of the interrupt, we say that it is an inefficient process, because how we say that it is an inefficient process? A processor, in case of the interrupt is raised, a processor stop the execution, gives the attention to that device, and ISR routine is executed. Okay, that means a CPU stop executing the current process. So it is not a efficient way to handle another request. So in case of the polling, which is also inefficient when the microcontroller does not get a request from the devices. As we previously discussed that there are 10 devices and a processor continuously checking for a device 1, 2, 3, 4, and lastly the fifth device need the service. That means previous 4 CPU cycles are waste. This is a polling also an inefficient way. In brief, interrupt is asynchronous, whereas a polling is a synchronous activity. Okay, interrupt in case of the interrupt, it is an asynchronous activity, whereas a polling is a synchronous activity. This is a main difference between an interrupt and a polling. An event that is triggered by the external components other than the CPU that alerts the CPU to perform the certain action. Okay, whereas a polling is an activity of sampling the status of an external device by client program as a synchronous activity. In case of the interrupt, when an interrupt occurred, the interrupt handler executes. Whereas in polling, a CPU provides the service. An interrupt can occur at any time, whereas a polling can occur at the regular interval. Interrupt request line indicates that a device needs a service. In case of the polling, a command ready bit indicates the device needs a service. Interrupt does not waste much CPU cycle, whereas a polling wastes a lot of CPU cycle. It is a interrupt is an efficient way when a device interrupts the CPU frequently. In case of the polling, it is also inefficient when a CPU rarely finds a request from a devices. Thank you friends for watching the video.